Hi, welcome everyone. I am Cheyenne and I'm the High Ability Learning Specialist at the Nebraska Department of Education. And today we're going to be talking about a report, kind of this state of the state report for Nebraska in terms of equity in high ability learning, identification, and programming. So before I get started, I am going to give my supervisor and colleague, Marissa Pizan, a chance to introduce herself and say a little bit about the project. So go ahead, Marissa.
Hi everybody, Marissa Pizan. I see some friends on the call, some familiar names and faces. I'm have been serving as the English Language Arts Specialist, and I'm transitioning into Assistant Director of Office of Teaching, Learning and Assessment. So Cheyenne is super knowledgeable about the project, probably more so than I am, but I just know that I'm excited about this content just because it's the first time or maybe the first time in a long time, we've really had some good data to kind of look at, explore some issues with identifying HAL students. So thank you all for being here.
Yes, and thank you, Marissa. So yes, we are excited to get into this and just share this data with you. In addition to this webinar, which is recorded, it will also be put on my website along with the full report. So you guys will have a chance if you would like to sift through the full report. I'm just going to give you the highlights and kind of explain some of the different numbers that we're looking at. So that will all be up on my website very soon. So just keep an eye out for that. So about this project, we started this with HAL Central, and that is the Regional Education Laboratory. And they are a change-oriented group that works with local, regional, statewide organizations about policy programs and practices. So they are set up specifically to do things like this. I know that HAL Central has had a couple other projects in Nebraska as well, working with our state department. And so we're very excited to work with them. They are specifically school improvement research partnerships. So we have had an alliance with them to work to improve capacity in Nebraska schools and providing high quality supports. And on this project specifically, we were lucky enough to work with Marzano Research, who was kind of the hub of HAL Central these past couple of years. And our lead researchers on this project were Jeanette Joyce, Caitlin Scott, Trudy Cherisharo, and Maddie Foister. So everything that you see in terms of data has been compiled and done by them. So really big shout out to HAL Central. They've made it really easy and digestible for us. So we're very excited about this project. So what kind of stemmed this project a little bit is as we started looking into what's going on in the state in terms of high ability learning, we, as Marissa said, didn't really have a lot of great data that existed in terms of what's going on. And so when we approached HAL Central, we asked them about what could we do in terms of looking at equity across the state. There have been some reports that put out kind of national state of the state things, but that is self-reported data, or their metrics are slightly different than what we were using. So we wanted something that we knew for sure came from our state and our data. So we took that data, gave it all to them, and they put out a really awesome report for us. And so the Equity and HAL report is specifically what we're going to talk about today. We're looking at the demographics of high ability learner students in Nebraska. So who is being identified and who's not being identified, as well as performance of their achievements. So they took all of the data of HAL students, they took all of the data of non-HAL students and put it into ratios and other different things that are easy to understand. And so we're going to be looking at how do those two big factors play out across the state of Nebraska. It's important to note before we get into this that we did use data from the 2018-19 school year due to the pandemic. That was the last year of really consistent quality data that we had. So that is the data year. Those are the data years that we're looking at. So we're going to jump right into it and first look at the identification report. So we looked at a couple different things. We looked at race and we also looked at student groups, which will be on the next slide. And so in the middle, there's a line for that yellow line says target ratio. And what the target ratio is that idea that we want the student population reflected in the high ability population. So for example, if your school population is 20% African American, you would want your HAL program to also be 20% African American so that the HAL program is reflective of the school environment. So in Nebraska, we are looking at this target 1-to-1 ratio. And as we can see here, the Asian and white and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander ratios are more than 1. Again, another important note is that when we were looking at the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander data, we do believe that there was a reporting problem. And so we are not totally sure that that data is reliable. So take all of those numbers kind of lightly, as again, we are not sure if that data is something that was reported correctly. So, and as we can see here, our under-identified populations, by far, Black and African American students are underrepresented in high ability programs, along with Hispanic and Latino students and American Indian or Native Alaskan students. So those are the students who are not being picked up by identification systems in the state. So we are under-identifying in those areas, but really what I found shocking is on the next slide is how far under target ratio we were for some different student groups. So students who are on free reduced lunch, highly mobile, special education, migrant, or English learners are being severely under-identified, not looked at for HAL programs. As you can see down below, the English language percentile is 0.01. So we are hardly identifying any English language learners for high ability programs in our state. Same for special education. So those students who have twice exceptionalities are not being looked at. So if a student is entered into special education programs, a lot of times they are not looked at for high ability programs, regardless of what's going on. So we need to kind of make sure that we are keeping these populations in mind, and we have implications and next steps on some other slides, but these are the populations that we're looking at right now that are being underrepresented. And I see Allison in the chat has a question. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask what I typed, sorry. Does the identification process involve language-based assessments? And I'm also wondering, what does the identification process look like in Nebraska? Are there a few tools that tend to be used a lot? And because I think there are some other ones that could separate language from that process.
Yes, that's a really great question and a really great point. Nebraska is local control, so each district has their own identification procedures. So each district, it's wildly ranging in Nebraska, but for the most part, there is some kind of quantitative measure that is language-based, whether that be an achievement test, a MAP score, those different kinds of things that are based on not only your knowledge of content, but your access to English in order for identification as well. Some schools and some districts are able to use nonverbal tests as qualifiers. I know that like Crete Public Schools does a lot of work with nonverbal and visual spatial testing, and places like Omaha and some of our bigger districts are able to provide testing that is nonverbal or is looking for specific skills such as those visual spatial skills or things that are not language based. So that's a really great question. And another thing that we see a lot in Nebraska is a lot of schools use universal screeners, and a lot of them use the cognitive abilities test. And while the cognitive abilities test is the best one statistically for finding students of underrepresented populations, it is still based on your access to the English language. So it is a big limiting factor how we use tests to identify students. But hopefully, as we put out the EL newsletter with Allison and Ann, things like using their scores for their, like using ALPA scores or using language acquisition rate as ways to look for these students is going to be, I think, a really big game changer in how we identify English language learners for high ability programs. It's a great question. And I see that Anne put in the chat that some schools use portfolios. So some of them use a broad variety of things. So checklists, student work, assessments, a bunch of different things into one portfolio to look at the student as a whole. So yes, while there is no one identification system across the state, a lot of them are based on tests in English. So yeah, great question. So with this information, we know that students of those historically marginalized populations are being under-identified for high ability programs. And it doesn't mean that those students don't exist. Like there are, I'm sure, a ton of gifted English language learners and a ton of gifted African-American students. It's just the measures that we're using are not finding those students right now. So something that we can think about is expanding our conceptions of high ability learners. And research shows across the board that a lot of times either schools who use referral systems or schools that use teacher-based ratings may not always find those students who are from historically marginalized populations. If we expand our conceptions of HAL to include students who maybe aren't our traditionally, best students, that's going to expand the number of students in our candidate pool for high ability testing. And so being able to look at all students and see those strengths versus seeing those deficits, such as not knowing English or some of those other things, is really important about in terms of identifying students from those historically marginalized populations. And we can improve our identification by using some of the different evidence-based best practices to find those students. So like we discussed, maybe that's using ALPA and English language acquisition. Maybe that is using assessments that are more specific to students in rural settings. I know that in research, a lot of times it's shown that you can get better information about students in rural settings by using community surveys or by using out of school products, such as 4-H or FFA or some of those other things. And so we need to expand our conceptions and improve our identification systems by doing non-traditional, quote unquote, things that maybe haven't been done traditionally. So looking at more than just a test score for students. And so next steps as a state would be identification best practice guidance document. And so that is something at the state level. We've assembled a team and we're working on the guidance document with hope for release in summer of 2020. It will be a document for educators to just be able to hopefully pick up and read and help modify their identification procedures based on what best practice is. So on the Nebraska Education Profile, for those of you who aren't familiar, you can go on and you can look specifically at your district's high ability demographics. And so if you see that your district is not identifying students who are from an African-American background, you can go into the best practice guidance document and see what are some measures that we can use to maybe find more African-American students. And so we're working on that document now. And again, we hope to have it out for administrator days this summer and in use next school year. That also includes providing widespread professional learning regarding students from all backgrounds. Again, a lot of times students from historically marginalized populations or non-white students display gifted characteristics in a way that differs from their white counterparts. And so how do we look at students and kind of get through our own personal idea of what high ability should look like in order to see all students that way? So after we looked at the identification rates, I'm going to stop for a second, actually. Does anybody else have any questions regarding the identification data that we just shared, next steps, or any just anything for the good of the group? Okay, great. So something else that we wanted to know are how are high ability learners achieving and how are they achieving by subgroup? So that is the next set of data that we looked at. And we did it a couple of different ways. We looked at NSCAS scores, ACT scores, MAP scores, but we're just going to discuss the NSCAS and ACT today because the MAP scores were very similar to both of those patterns, but the MAP scores will be in the full report. So we will be looking at NSCAS scores, and so there will be columns that say what percentage of HAL students were on track and what percentage of HAL students were CCR benchmark. And so on track are those students who will likely be ready for the next grade level. They're right on par. And then the CCR benchmark are those students who are provide evidence that they're ready for academic success beyond the next grade level. So that would be kind of the advanced level on those tests. So just keeping those definitions in mind as we move forward into the tables that we're going to show. So, oh, that's a little blurry, I'm sorry. So if we looked at NSCAS ELA grades 3 through 8, and something that immediately popped out at me is that only 49% of our identified high ability students are testing in the advanced level on the NSCAS ELA. And so while 90% of them are proficient, so between the on track and the CCR benchmark, 90% of them are efficient, but only less than half are testing at the advanced level in ELA. And so I found that really interesting, kind of a little bit lower than I was expecting, honestly. We would expect our identified high ability students to be the ones scoring in those advanced levels on those assessments. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this is that that performance is maybe a little bit lower than anticipated. And then the other one that I've outlined here is that the number of high ability English language learners to score on the CCR benchmark level is 0%. So even our students who are English language learners that are identified as high ability are still not accessing that advanced level on the NSCAS. And so again, I'm going to have some implications and next steps on other slides, but that's just something that I wanted to point out for you. As you can see, through the other subgroups, a lot of them are really low, like the free and reduced lunch students are only performing at 35% advanced. So these students, even though they're identified as high ability, there is still something going on where they're not accessing the higher level. So just wanted to point that out. And even here, you can see that the number of English language learners that we have identified in Nebraska is 23. So it is a very low number, and we need to, again, work on increasing that. Again, this is the NSCAS ELA 3.8 by race. So as we can see, our 2 or more races, white and Asian, we've got a 95, 91, 90% proficient rate. They are outperforming their counterparts by a lot. So we can see here the Hispanic or Latinx students, while these numbers still aren't great, they're still higher than the Black and African American and American Indian Alaska Native numbers. So here we see that only 66% of our identified American Indian or Alaska Native students are proficient on these assessments. Only 78% of Black or African American students. So we see that these numbers again, they've been identified as HAL, but there's still something not happening that's allowing them to perform at the advanced level. And so when looking at these numbers, there are a couple different things to keep in mind. It's where are we going to go in order to help them perform at those higher levels, and how are we going to get them to perform at those next levels? And so we want to again, this is math NSCAS. Only 36% of our high ability students are advanced on the math NSCAS, which again was much lower than ELA. In ELA it was 49%. Here it's only 36% of our advanced students in math. So, and even lower for our free and reduced lunch students. So our students of poverty are only achieving that advanced mark at 21%. And then I put a green box around the English language learners here. While 9% is still really low, and we would like to see it higher, the ELA was 0%. So we can see here that the math NSCAS, the ELA students or the ELL students are performing much better on the math NSCAS than they are the ELA NSCAS. And then again, by student group, on math, it's lower. The NSCAS ELA for African Americans is higher, much higher than the ELA. On ELA, they were only 34% here, and here there's 60% on math, but still only 16% hitting that advanced mark. And then interestingly, our Hispanic or Latinx students performed much lower on the math assessment than the ELA assessment, which is kind of an opposite pattern that we see of our EL students who perform better on math and worse on ELA. So, and again, we had the white and Asian students are performing much higher than their non-white counterparts on these different assessments. We also looked at the ACT. So for ACT, the on track means that they will be likely to access first year content at some of the Nebraska post-secondary institutions without remediation. And then the ACT benchmark is our goal. That means that they are college ready and that they should be able to enroll in courses with no remediation and have a really great chance of receiving a C or better. So that ACT benchmark, when we give the ACT in 11th grade, is really what we're looking for in order to be ready for college. And as we can see here, our high ability students as a whole, they are only performing, 78% of them are performing at that college and career ready mark in 11th grade. So that again was a little shocking. It's a little bit low. We would expect our high ability students to be performing better in the 11th grade since they are getting ready to go on to post-secondary institutions. And similarly, all of these numbers are pretty low for college readiness for our subgroups. So especially English language learners and migrant students, much, much lower than free reduced lunch and special education. So the ACT 11th grade performance was not quite on benchmark. And similarly by race, we see that white and Asian students are, for the most part, pretty ready for on that ACT benchmark in English. But we have our American Indian and Alaska Native students are performing much lower on the 11th grade ACT in English. And so they're not showing that preparedness for college without remediation. Similarly, these are still pretty low. They're much higher than the disparaging numbers here, but our Black and African American and Hispanic or Latinx students are also not performing on that college ready level on their ACT English. We saw a similar trend for math. It's almost the exact same number as the English ACT. Only 71% of students are ready for college that are identified as high ability learners. And then we see here that the EL students performed much lower on the ACT math than they did on the ACT English, which again is opposite of that 3 through 8 NSCAS, where they performed higher on the math and lower on the English. So that was a really interesting piece of data to see, is that at this high school level, that their English performance was better than their math performance on this assessment. And then finally, we also looked at ACT math by race, and we see here a similar trend of Asian, white, and 2 or more race students performing pretty well, ready for college, and our American Indian, Native Alaskan students are not, and again, some pretty low numbers on Black and African American or Hispanic students as well. So what we're seeing again is that kind of a similar identification trend, is that our white and Asian students are performing better on these assessments than our students who are of color or from marginalized backgrounds. And what that means is that all students may not have access to high quality differentiation in programs to provide them with challenge. So just because a student is identified as a high ability learner does not mean that they're going to automatically be successful on these assessments. They need programming and they need curriculum and differentiation to help support them in those endeavors. And so maybe not all of our students across the state are having that same access to that high quality differentiation and curriculum. And also access to advanced academics. I know that the Office of Civil Rights in 2020 put out a study that students from English language learner backgrounds across the board have less access to AP and advanced academic classes. Similarly, an older OCR study showed schools that are higher populations of Black or African American students also historically have less advanced academic offerings, such as advanced chemistry, advanced languages, and AP courses. So some of these issues may come back to access to higher level academics. And then we also need to place more of an emphasis on collaboration, especially in those situations where students may not have the privileges that they need in order to succeed. So that looks like the EL teacher collaborating with the classroom teacher and providing those supports so that the EL students can access that higher level curriculum, or helping fill in maybe some gaps for students of poverty that don't come in with that background knowledge that some of their peers do, or providing those IEP supports for special education students while accessing higher level curriculum. And so opportunities for collaboration in the schools will really help with those students performing at that advanced level. So for next steps, again, everything comes back to professional learning and awareness of the needs of high ability students. One of the most common myths cited by the National Association for Gifted Children is that this idea that high ability students will be fine on their own, that they will get their work done and they'll be fine. And we know based on research that that's not true. If the students aren't challenged and they're not learning every day, they're not growing. And so they're not going to reach the advanced levels that are commensurate with their abilities. And so we need to learn more about what do those high ability students actually need and how can we provide accurate or appropriate differentiation. This includes strong PLCs, back to that idea of collaboration. Inviting the high ability learner teacher into your PLCs, or inviting the EL teacher, or inviting all these different people to the table to collaborate so that we are ensuring that we're meeting the different needs of all of these students. And so having those really strong PLC structures will help us collaborate and communicate about student success. Part of what that I'm doing at the department level to help with this is the HAL and MTSS pilot. So we've got 15 pilot schools that we're working with to implement multi-tiered systems of support for their high ability learners. And that includes a ton of professional development for classroom teachers regarding differentiation for high ability students. It's training for HAL facilitators on spotting students who need to be identified, or how can we use those multi-tiered systems of support to qualify students for high ability. So that is something that we're doing in 15 schools across the state right now to kind of help with some of these different achievement things. And providing resources and guidance for smaller rural schools, I know is something that is on my docket for this next year, is how can we give students in those smaller rural settings access to advanced opportunities. And now that everyone is familiar with Zoom and everything is online, it's going to be a lot easier to leverage some of those different experiences. So someone in Western Nebraska can do a similar experience to somebody in the Omaha area, or if your school doesn't offer AP, you can Zoom into an AP class at another school. So working on how do we connect smaller schools with some of those bigger schools to provide some of those advanced opportunities. Were there any questions regarding the achievement scores? I know it's a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but I'll just give you a second to digest and ask questions if you have them. Okay. So the last thing that we want to look at are graduation rates. And we looked at the graduation rates of high ability students by, again, student subgroup and race. So red denotes that they are below the state average, blue is above the state average, and yellow would be right at the state average. And the state average in 2018-19, I believe, was 88%. So these are the numbers we're working on. So our HAL students are identified HAL students are graduating at a 96% graduation rate, which is pretty good. It's above the average. Even our free and reduced lunch students are graduating at a high rate. But as we can see here, only 81% of our EL HAL students are graduating, 85% in special education, even lower for migrant and highly mobile students. And so they may be identified as high ability learners, but they're only graduating at a 48% rate. And so We see a similar trend kind of with race. It's a little bit better by race, actually, all of them, except for this one, which we are unsure of the reliability of the data for this group. We see that by race, they're graduating all above the state average. So that is something encouraging to see, is that high ability students by race are graduating. But again, back to these numbers of if they're part of a specific subgroup, they are not as likely to graduate as students who are not of any of these subgroups. And so what this means is that maybe, again, not everybody has access to advanced academics and appropriate supports. And so those appropriate supports are really the key. So for example, we know our special education high ability students are not graduating as much as their non-special education peers. Maybe they are taking those advanced academic classes and not receiving appropriate supports, or they're afraid to take those advanced academic classes because of the special education diagnosis. And so providing those appropriate supports, same for EL students, being able to provide those language supports, but let them take those AP classes and those advanced classes so that they're being challenged. And providing affective supports is so important, especially at that high school time. Students are in that transitional period of looking towards college or looking towards a career, and we need to provide those supports for high ability students. We know that a lot of times high ability students, once they get to high school, aren't quite as prepared for high school as we would like them to be. Either things have always been easy for them, so they've not developed any kind of study skills, organizational skills, or they may by that time have either underachievement tendencies, or maybe they've got kind of self-esteem insecurities. And so how can we provide those social and emotional supports for those students to encourage them in and through high school? And capitalizing on interests that span beyond school. Maybe we can keep those kids in school if they're interested in what they're doing. I have read a couple of articles that are anecdotal about high ability students who are dropouts from high school. And a lot of times they just felt as if they weren't understood and they didn't belong, and that they were going to go crazy if they had to be in school any longer. And so providing those things that maybe gear them towards their career, or maybe they're really interested in one of the CTE fields and hooking them up there, or maybe they want to go to trade school instead of college. And so making sure that we are paying attention to what they're interested in. Again, not that just because they're a high ability learner doesn't mean everybody's path is a traditional college path. And so making sure that we are making the high school experience worth it for them, which is good for all students. But for high ability students specifically, we want to make sure that we're capitalizing on their strengths so that they can turn that someday into expertise and eminence. And so again, that comes down to providing awareness and support for high ability students in transitional periods. As they're transitioning from middle school to high school, that freshman year, we need to provide a lot of social and emotional support, support for executive functioning skills, how to study, how to plan your time, and how to fail, because a lot of times these kids have never failed at something until they reach high school and they're in these advanced classes. So teaching them those different skills in those transitional periods is imperative. Whether that's myself or counselors or anybody in your school, providing resources to assist those students with affective issues. So maybe if they hook them up with a group that's outside of school, that's something they're interested in, or maybe they need some kind of like support from a counselor in terms of some of those different issues like perfectionism and underachievement, and making sure we're equipped with those resources. So when a HAL student comes to us, we know what to do, or know maybe where to send them. And making connections for advanced academic offerings. Again, that's maybe that looks like connecting with the local college and starting a dual enrollment program at your school, or offering more AP classes. Or I know in the smaller areas, maybe like 3 or 4 schools teaming up and offering like splitting the cost of what it takes to get a teacher trained for an AP class. And then students from 3 of those schools can jump online and I'll take the AP class. So being really flexible and creative with how can we offer these advanced academic courses, even if maybe in our school only 2 or 3 students want to take them, how do we hook them up with an area where they can all have access to these different offerings. So that is, I know I talked really fast, but that's a rundown of all the data we got, and we are just so excited to have this information and to inform our next steps forward. Now we see where the strengths are, and now we see where we need to improve as a state and how we can move forward in that. And so now, again, I'm going to pause, let you reflect on the data, and just be quiet for a second and let me know if you have any questions or want to see anything again. Either in the chat or if somebody wants to speak up, is there anything that maybe surprised you, or maybe something that didn't surprise you that you kind of already knew?
Cheyenne, Andy DeFries from Millard Public Schools. Thanks so much for all the great information that you have here. Nothing really surprises me in it. I mean, there's some things that are sad, but we also have limitations in our rule where we require people to identify HAL kids, but we don't actually require them to do anything for them. And so there's a lot of work to be done in this area, but I think that the data prevents a compelling case for action for us. We're working with a Javits grant to try to do some of the similar work in our school district to identify and look at our procedures. So I don't have anything other than good work. So thank you.
Yes, I love the project that's going on in Millard with the NRGC. So I'm very excited to hear the results of that and the work that you guys are doing in there.
I appreciate the information as well, Cheyenne. It's very interesting just having the data. It's pretty consistent with other data that we've seen. And I know this is a quick overview. Some of the recommendations I think are happening. I think it's always a question of saying to what degree. For example, co-teaching. Co-teaching is a fantastic model. It's one that tends to be pretty expensive. Not every district can commit to it. Not every district has the personnel to do it. So I'm interested just to see how this may help to support some of the other efforts that we make as well, knowing that the lack of English is not synonymous with ability. You know, that our students just need the opportunity to learn English, but we can't wait until they learn English. I mean, I think this just really supports everything, the work that Ann and I do, which is trying to support our districts as they are working to support English learners and the educators who work with them. We've got to just keep doing it.
Yes, thank you. That's a really just excellent point. And I know that trying to support, we need support in all spaces. We need support in EL, we need support in special ed, we need support in all of these different areas. And you're so right. A lot of times we don't want to wait until it's too late for this to provide supports for those students. And so part of having this data again is driving my direction. And so knowing that we definitely need supports in these spaces will allow me again to make that compelling case for the work that I'm doing. And so I look forward to collaborating with you and Ann more, and with special education more, and with Shirley's office more. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. It's a really great point. I'm going to go ahead and throw my email up there. If you guys have any questions about the report or want to talk further about anything that you saw today, feel free to reach out to me via email. Again, the full report is going to be on my website, which includes all of the tables, a couple tables we didn't go over, and all of the descriptions on how they broke down the data and those different kinds of things. So that will all be publicly available soon. And if you guys don't have any other questions, thank you so much for attending today. And I look forward to collaborating with all of you in the future.
Cheyenne, just a note that that was data is always informative. So the more data we have, and I think I have to agree with Allison and Ann, it's reflective. And Andy, and we don't have many surprises in math. I mean, our identification is probably one of our bigger struggles in mathematics that we have to continue working together on. So good work. And it's, like I said, the data says a lot, and it just means that we continue to do a lot of work together. So congratulations on your efforts.
Thank you. Again, like we said, we all kind of had a hunch of what was going on, but now we have actual hard data. We know what's going on in the state, and we know what we need to do to improve. And so I'm glad to have this, and we'll hopefully be able to continue to share it out and to make these efforts. And there are so many districts doing so many great things, and just as a state, we're doing a lot of really great things. This also just really directs where we can go to be even better. All right, I am going to let you guys go. Thank you guys so much. And again, if you have any other questions, I'll be on for a few minutes, and you guys can always reach out to me via email. Thank you.